So last night I was watching the Joe Rogan podcast where he had on Tim Pool and then the Twitter executive slash lawyer and Jack Dorsey back to talk about, some of Twitter's issues. And the part I really want to hone in on is when, at least for me, is when they started talking about the hashtag learntocode incident, because I remember with crystal clarity when that went down. I happen to know a lot of the journalists that got laid off at the various organizations, Huffington Post, BuzzFeed, and Vice, and I remember when they were tweeting, hey, just got laid off, or the text messages were coming in, or the DMs were coming in, or the personal notes like, hey, yep, I've been let go too. And I remember the days and the hours that was happening, and I remember watching in real time them tweeting, hey, I've been laid off, and all the tweets back at them talking about like, oh, great, hooray, finally, BuzzFeed got what they deserved, or Vice got what they deserved, hashtag learntocode, hashtag learntocode. And just a kind of onslaught of tweets at these various journalists getting laid off in real time about learn to code. And two things I think can be true at the same time here, which is one, that a lot of the journalists laid off from these news organizations, however you may feel about the news organization itself, you may find them totally fake news, you might like some of their articles and think, oh, some of the other articles are trash, you might actually like them, whatever. Most of the journalists, if not all of the journalists from these publications, that were laid off, the ones that were laid off, weren't the ones that had anything to do with making the articles or writing the reports, earlier on about how laid off truck drivers or laid off miners in North Carolina or Missouri should learn to code. They had nothing to do with the kind of thesis that, middle-aged men that, are otherwise uneducated have just been laid off from their career, working at the oil fields, and now they should learn to code because it's capitalism and you got to keep up with the times. They had nothing to do with that initial meme. They had nothing to do with proposing those ideas. They just wound up at the receiving end of a large body of people who thought those ideas were exemplary of a total elitism of a certain class of job occupation, the kind of commentariat. And so in some ways I can find a lot of sympathy for these journalists that are getting laid off and at the same time feeling like they're getting dogpiled, being told, hey, learn to code, when they're like, what is this? I was never told anybody they should learn to code. I never suggested they should learn to code. This is me. Don't point your finger at me. But at the same time, watching that podcast with Tim Pool question the Twitter's executive slash lawyer and Jack Dorsey, it's obvious that Twitter does indeed listen to their main user base, and their main power user base is indeed media journalists on the West and East Coast, primarily in San Francisco, LA, and New York City. And that because media journalists are Twitter's main user base, they're the ones that use it the most often, they're the ones that drive the most traffic to the site, they're all verified, Twitter is highly receptive and highly, open to interacting with their main power base. And so when their main power base started complaining like, hey, I'm getting dogpiled, or like, hey, this is harassment, Twitter obviously changed their algorithm or told the people that moderate things to interpret learn to code as harassment or harassing language, when obviously it's not. And when the Twitter lawyer talks about how like, well, hashtag learn to code, we found was coded language for violence or, threats of violence, it just wasn't true. And you look at most of the tweets at that time, there was not coded language for violence. If anything, it was simply coded language for, hey, you're part of a socioeconomic class that comes off as elitist. I have a disdain for you, just like you seem to have a disdain for the Midwest. That's what it was coded language for. And so my takeaway was that, like, no, definitely, like, Twitter was bending the rules for their main power base, which is, the media slash journalists. And because they're bending the rules for their main power base, main user base, which is media slash journalists, and because journalists and people in New York City and LA tend to be progressive slash liberal, they're therefore going to come off like a liberal progressive bias, which just they wind up intrinsically having because they're more receptive to their power base. So there you go. Those are the 2 points. I think, like, one, at the end of the day, is learn to code. Was it harassing or harassing language? No, it was a meme, and it was a somewhat pointed meme at a lot of people expressing their distaste for what they view as elitism in the media. I think that is true, an entirely valid form of speech. At the same time, I also can empathize with journalists laid off who are getting dogpiled on Twitter being told to learn to code when they had nothing to do with the original thesis of the idea that people should just learn to code to keep up with the times. Anyway, those are my thoughts. If you want to watch another video, you can click around here with my new shaved head. Thanks for watching, guys. I'll see you guys in the next video.